Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining on this Thursday. Welcome to the first meeting of the PASS Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion virtual group. Today's session, Identity is More Than a Column Property, is part one of a DEI fundamental series. This will be a recorded and posted online session. You will receive an email letting you know when a recording is available. My name is Denisha Malone. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I am a co-leader of this diversity, equity, and inclusion virtual group. I'll be today's moderator. And I have a few intro slides before I hand over the reins to Andrea. This year's PASS will host their first ever PASS Virtual Summit on November 10th through the 13th. Head over to pass.org to register and learn more about this year's lineup. The next Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion virtual group session will be in 2 weeks on Thursday, November 5th at noon, U.S. Eastern Standard Time. It will be part two of this Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion fundamental series. You can connect with PASS online using your favorite social media platform. Today's speaker is Andrea Mascher. Andrea leads the SQL Server Database Administration team at the University of Iowa. Andrea is an advocate for gender diversity in STEM and co-founded Iowa's Women in Technology user group to promote a climate of inclusivity and professional growth for women and non-binary individuals in technical fields at Iowa. Andrea is also a co-leader here at the PASS Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion virtual group. Without further ado, I'll hand things over to her.
Thanks, Denisha. Oops. So thanks for everyone for joining us today. As Denisha mentioned, my name is Andrea Mascher. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I lead the SQL Server DBA team at the University of Iowa. Let's see. So quick disclaimer, on September 22nd, 2020, the White House issued an executive order that prohibits grant-receiving institutions from providing training on certain facets of diversity, equity, and inclusion. While I'm employed by the University of Iowa, I'm coming to you today as an independent and private speaker. I do not represent the university. Just like technology, DEI is a constantly changing topic. I've tried my best to use appropriate and respectful language, but my understanding about this is incomplete. So if I say anything incorrect or harmful, I ask that you let me know so that I can avoid doing it in the future. So let's get started. When a data professional hears the word identity, this is probably what they think of, an identity column in a table, but that's not what we're here to talk about today. In the context of DEI, identity is simply belonging to a group. It's a foundational concept because you need to understand identity before you see how it impacts people's lived experiences. And these differences in lived experiences is why we have to be mindful about having better DEI practices. Everyone has multiple identities, and sometimes something that looks like a single identity is really a composite of multiple identities, or the aspect of that identity changes based on your context. For example, I work in the DBA team at a Big Ten university, and I'm the manager. When I'm meeting with the people in my work group, being the manager, being the most experienced SQL DBA, means that my voice has a bit more weight than maybe other people on the team. When I'm meeting with my server admins or developers, being the DBA manager doesn't quite mean the same thing because these are people who don't report to me. Also, I work in a different technical stack than them, so they might not understand how awesome having SQL Server skills are, and they just don't value it the same way. In both of these situations, my identity is the same. I'm still coming to the table as the manager of the team, but it means something very different. So today we're going to go through a couple of areas of identity that people often have questions about. particularly in the workplace. There are tons of other identities that we won't cover, like socioeconomic class, religion, spiritual beliefs, political leanings. These are all very important to people, but we just wanted to keep it to a few. Many people use the terms race, ethnicity, and nationality interchangeably. And there's a connection between these concepts, but they aren't the same thing. Because it's related to what you literally see, race is the area that we tend to talk about the most. Race is about physical differences that people believe to be socially significant. Even though a lot of our physical traits are inherited or genetic, racial groupings aren't a biological thing. They are a culture thing, a cultural construct. These only have meaning because the society that we live in gives them meaning. For example, there's a lot of variation in eye color. Some people have violet or green or brown or hazel. A person's lived experiences not impacted too much based on their eye color. It's not socially significant. In the US, however, differences in skin color really do impact how a person is treated in society day to day. It is socially significant. While race is about the inherited physical traits, ethnicity is about the things that you learn and the things that you do. In the US, some people simplify ethnicity to the question, what country did your family live in before they came here? But there are a couple of problems with framing it like that. National borders are changing all the time. Many groups and ethnicities have been scattered throughout the world because of colonialization, forced migration, slave trade. And then also there's cultural assimilation. Traditions might not be passed down through the generations. So if your family came here a while ago, you might not have the same cultural knowledge. So yeah, race is one of those topics that's a bit more complicated than it seems at first. It's about physical things like skin color, hair color and texture, the shape of your facial features like your eyes or your bone structure. Ethnicity is about your cultural practices. These are the things that you do, your history. And then finally, nationality is a legal or political concept. It only asks, what country are you a citizen of? Another area of identities that we talk about in the workplace quite frequently is disability, which is the limitations we have that affect life activities. You can't always see a person's disability status just by looking at them. Many disabilities are invisible or temporary or transient. When you talk about somebody's disability status, it's important to remember that this is just one component of that person's identity. So try to use people-centric language and don't reduce them to just this one area. Don't say so-and-so is blind, say so-and-so has a visual impairment. Given the stresses that the COVID pandemic have created, I did want to put a spotlight on mental health in particular. According to NAMI, 1 in 5 Americans adults experience mental health issues each year. And in the 2019 open source mental illness survey, mental health in tech survey, 41% of respondents said that they currently have a mental health diagnosis or disorder. That's double the general public's numbers. Reducing the stigma around mental health and being cognizant of the mental health and well-being of the people around us really does help us all be better together, especially in these stressful times. Before I move on, Denisha, are there any questions yet?
No questions yet.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you.
Mhm.
So let's go on to pride, which is the term that people use to kind of say the LGBTQIA plus family of gender and orientation identities. And that's a mouthful. I just tripped all over it. And it can be confusing for people if you aren't already part of this community. So I think it'll make a lot more sense when we break down the concept of gender. This is the genderbread person. It's a framework to understand gender and sexuality through continuums. Biological sex, your physical body, gender identity, your internal perception of self, expression, the actions that you do, orientation, relationships. What I really like about this is that it goes from 0 to lots for all of these different dimensions, instead of representing these as binary identities on opposite sides of the same spectrum. So let's zoom in on some of these areas. Biological sex asks the question, what are your physical and genetic traits? The terms that most people are familiar with are female and male, but there's also something called intersex, which describes people that have a combination of typically male physical features or genetics and typically female physical features and genetics. Gender identity asks the question, what is the social and cultural role that you align with? It's a person's internal and deeply held sense of gender. It's about how they perceive themselves. The gender identities most people are familiar with are woman and man. There's also a variety of other terms to describe identities that are neither predominantly woman nor predominantly man, including non-binary, bigender, gender fluid, agender. When gender identity aligns with biological sex, the term cis, spelled C-I-S, is typically used. When gender identity does not align with biological sex, the term transgender or trans may be used. For example, a person that was assigned the female sex at birth and has the gender identity woman might be described as a cis woman. A person that was assigned the male sex at birth and has the gender identity woman might be described as a transgender woman or a trans woman. Gender expression asks the question, how do you present yourself to the world? It's the physical manifestation of your gender identity through things like your clothing, your hairstyle, your voice, your body language. Some of the terms that people use to describe gender expression might include feminine, masculine, or androgynous. Transition is the term that we use to describe when a transgender person chooses to make their gender expression, how they look to others, match their gender identity, who they feel like they are on the inside, rather than the biological sex that they were assigned at birth. A lot of different activities might go into a person's transition, like coming out to your friends, your family, your colleagues, getting legal documents changed, like your official name. Some people also do medical changes, like getting a surgery or having hormone therapy, but not everyone does. Transition is really a different scenario for each person going through it, so it's best not to make assumptions. And so the fourth dimension that we talk about is orientation, and it asks, who do you like and love? This framework divides orientation up into two different areas. Sexual attraction, so the desire for physical contact in relationships, and romantic attraction, the desire for emotional relationships. Some people feel both, some people feel neither, and some people feel one a heck of a lot more than they feel the other. The term that we use to describe someone's orientation first considers that person's own gender identity, and then the gender identity of the people that they're attracted to. When somebody is only attracted to the same gender as their own, the terms gay or lesbian are typically used. When someone is only attracted to the dominant gender that is not their own, the term straight is typically used. And then when someone is attracted to a variety of gender identities, terms like bisexual or pansexual might be used. When someone doesn't feel a strong attraction to anyone, regardless of their gender, We use terms like asexual or aromantic depending on the kind of attractions they don't feel. It's worth noting that gender expression is the only dimension that can be passively observed, particularly in a professional workplace. If you haven't seen my medical records, you don't really know my biological sex any more than you know my blood type or if I've had my appendix removed. Often, people make assumptions about the gender of another person based on that person's appearance or by their name. And to reduce confusion, some people choose to share their pronouns, just like Denisha and I did when we were introducing ourselves for this session. The feminine pronouns she, her, and hers, and the masculine pronouns he, him, and his are generally understood by most English speakers. Singular they is currently the most common used gender neutral pronoun in English. And then there are more than a dozen what's called neo-pronoun sets. I've shown here z, zim, zers as an example. Referring to a person as it or he, she is pretty offensive. And intentionally calling them something other than their preferred name or using something other than their preferred pronouns is really disrespectful and hurtful. So let's return to the pride umbrella. Biological sex is represented by I, intersex. Gender identity and gender expression are represented by transgender, trans, transstar, and agender. Orientation is represented by lesbian, gay, bisexual, asexual, and aromantic. And then finally, the other letters and symbols are there to represent a desire to be inclusive. Questioning, it refers to people that are still exploring their gender and orientation. Queer is a blanket term for genders and orientations other than cis and straight. It used to be a derogatory term, but a lot of people have reclaimed it these days, which is why I've marked it as controversial. The plus symbol acknowledges that our understanding about gender and orientation is still evolving. We might not right now have an agreed upon language on how to express the person's identity. And then some people say that the A can stand for ally, while others disagree, saying that allyship is an action, a thing you do. It's not an identity. Before I move on, Denisha, are there any questions?
There are no questions, but there is a, I think it's, I don't know if she wants to clarify something or if
Yeah.
she's just marked it as a note, but Victoria Guarnieri says there are three main areas: social transition and medical transition and legal transition.
Yeah.
Medical, hormone replacement therapy, counseling, surgery, etc. I think she wants to just confirm that maybe.
Yeah. I think that aligns with the most common areas that go into transition.
Okay.
Awesome. So now that we kind of have some different identity groups in mind, let's talk about intersectionality. We all have multiple identities, and how they combine together is what makes each person's experience unique. The needs and priorities, and Denisha, do you want to mute yourself?
Yeah.
The needs, priorities, and experiences of people in an identity group are going to be different when you take additional dimensions of the members' identities into account. So, for example, let's think about people who identify as women. The concerns of wealthy women are going to be really different than those who are less affluent. When you're using an online dating app, the kinds of pickup lines white women receive are very different than those that Black women or Asian women or Latinx women receive. Using public restrooms is a lot more complicated when you're a trans woman than you are when you're a cis woman. So, since we all have different and complex intersecting identities, let's do this exercise that explores how different parts of our identity resonate with us when we're in these different contexts. So here's a list of identities. Feel free to add others that matter to you. This is kind of more of a thought exercise, but I'm going to go through some statements and just try to choose one identity that answers these statements. So, for example, the statement might be, this is the identity that means the most to me in this moment. And if I had to choose one area, I might say career. I'm presenting for a past virtual group right now, and my career as a DBA is how I became involved with the organization. It's how I'm able to present with you to you today. And so that's in the front of my mind right now. These are things that are specific and unique to each individual. There's no right or wrong answer. And I won't display my personal responses for the rest of the statements. Remember to select just one area. Let's get started. The identity that I'm most aware of when I'm at home. This is the area of my identity that I'm most aware of when I'm at work. People judge me the most for having this identity. When I think of my friends, this is the identity we usually have in common. This is the identity that I tend to hide from other people. I think about having this identity the most often. This is the identity that brings me the most joy. So let's reflect on this. Did you choose the same aspect of your identity for all of these statements? Was it hard to choose just one of your identities in any of these areas? Maybe sometimes your answer would change depending on other things going on in these situations. Would your colleagues respond differently to any of these? What about your immediate family or your best friend? So you're still the same person, even if your answer is different for all of these. It can be uncomfortable when one of your identities is different from everyone else's in a situation. So, for example, we often talk about pet owners as dog people and cat people, and I love cats. And I'm really, really afraid of most dogs, at least when I'm around them in person. Sometimes I get into a conversation with a group of dog owners, and they pull out their phones, they show their adorable pics of their puppers, and they share funny stories of all the silly things that their pets do. And I totally love seeing and hearing these things. I don't usually say, oh, I'm really afraid of dogs, mostly because I don't want to stop the conversation, but also because of how some dog owners have responded to that in the past. Some have tried to convert me. Oh, but you're going to love muffin chops. She's different. Or they might react like I just insulted them personally, saying that they aren't a good dog owner. So, what I do is I just try to downplay that part of me at work. It isn't too difficult to downplay my dog phobia at work. There aren't a lot of dog-oriented tasks in my day-to-day tech responsibilities. You can't see my opinions or feelings about dogs every time you look at me. I can go weeks, months without ever thinking about a dog. The consequence of my phobia is that sometimes things feel a little awkward when I bring it up. Other aspects of my identity are always there and can have a huge impact on my personal or professional life. For example, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, would make sure that he was always seated behind a table before any of his cabinet members would arrive to a meeting. He wasn't exactly hiding his disability. However, he was pushing that identity into the background or covering. Covering isn't quite the same thing as, staying in the closet. You aren't completely hiding or obscuring your identity, you're just de-emphasizing it. The pressure to cover also isn't quite the same thing as discrimination. These are proactive and sort of defensive acts that people are taking to make it more likely that they'll be included. It's something that takes up a lot of energy, and it requires a lot of intentional action from people who are in marginalized identity groups. In a 2019 report from Deloitte, 61% of employees surveyed covered at least one aspect of their identity. This number went up to 79% for Black people and 83% for people who are members of the LGBT community. This report talks about 4 different axes of covering. So the first is appearance. An example of this might be how Black women might feel pressured to chemically straighten their hair to de-emphasize their race, or a disabled person might avoid using their cane in public. Affiliation is about the connection between stereotypes and actions. So an employee that grew up poor or in a rural setting, they might avoid sharing that in the workplace because they know that the default assumptions when you live in a more urban area about people from poor or rural settings is that they don't have the same level of intelligence or competence, and they just don't want to have that association exist. For advocacy, a parent of a transgender child might call them my kid so that they can avoid bringing attention to their child's pronouns. A person of color might not speak up when jokes are made about people with their same race. A woman might not bring up concerns about gender bias in a job search. And then the 4th area of covering is association. Examples of this would be how a woman might avoid sponsoring other women in the workplace because she's concerned about perceptions of having favoritism for women. A person that has members of their family with mental health issues, they might advocate for this in private, but not bring it up in public because they're concerned that people will assume that they have a mental health issue too. A person that had a cancer diagnosis but is in remission, they might avoid drawing attention to their medical status because people will assume that they aren't well enough to do the work. Even though people cover their social identities and that somewhat compensates for bias in the workplace, they might still experience microaggressions, which are that pattern of casual and frequent harms that someone experiences as a result of their identity. And these acts of exclusion can come in all sorts of forms. So feeling like you're an alien in your own land, people asking, where are you really from? Where were you born? Hey, can you teach me words in your language? There are backhanded compliments. You are so articulate. You're a credit to your race. There are stereotypical assumptions, like asking a woman who is your colleague to take the notes or order lunch for the team, asking an Asian person to help with a math or science problem. There can be invasion of personal space, like touching someone's hair without asking permission. Manspreading, which is where a guy will definitely put his whole body well outside the bounds of the chair he's sitting in. There are idioms, jokes, things like Indian giver, gypped, ninja, imitating accents. There are things that happen in your physical environment. So in clothing stores, the mannequins tend to be tall and thin. On campuses, most of the buildings are named after old dead white men. So these sorts of things, they don't seem like a big deal when you talk about them in isolation as individual instances, but they really add up. And these are really exhausting to manage when they're a constant part of your workplace culture. This is something that takes a psychological toll on people, and it really harms productivity and emotional health and physical health. So before we start talking about how to become a better ally, Denisha, are there any other questions or comments in the chat?
No, no questions or comments.
Cool, thank you.
Mhm.
So allyship, it's a lot easier to say that you're an ally than it is to actually be an ally. Anyone can be an ally. The key thing to understand or recognize is that even though you aren't part of an oppressed or marginalized community, you can still make an effort to understand their struggle, what they go through every day. As an ally, you might not completely understand what it's like, but you can still take on this struggle as if it was your own. And you can do what's in your power to help carry that weight for the people who are dealing with it. So one way to think about allyship is the LEAP framework. So when there's somebody you want to be an ally towards, start by listening and learning from their experiences, asking them what's going on. Engage with them, not just one time, but in a variety of settings, professional and casual. Ask them not just about their existing experiences, but what they want to accomplish. What are their goals moving forward? What is their vision? And then provide opportunities, give them suggestions, encouragement, support. So there are a lot of more specific tactics that we can apply to becoming an ally. The most important thing to me is to do your homework. And by joining this webinar today, I think that that's very good progress. It can be really tempting to ask women or people of color or other groups to just say, hey, tell me about your experience with inequality and injustice. But that really unfairly burdens them with a lot of emotional and cognitive labor. They are reliving these things when they tell you about it. A good ally takes the time to read, listen, watch, deepen their own understanding first, do internal work. They take the time to recognize that the advantages, opportunities, resources, and power that they have are things that other people might not have. Once you start doing that groundwork, that's a good place to start asking the questions of your colleagues. So some questions that you might ask are, hey, I'm curious, what are the things that you find most challenging day to day? The kinds of things that I might not notice. Would you be comfortable sharing some of that with me? If there was one thing you wish your colleagues would do more of to improve the workplace climate, what would that be? Or if there's something we could stop doing every day, what would that be? If you were giving me advice on how to really show up as a colleague and make our workplace more fair, more welcoming, what would that advice look like? It's good to deliberately seek feedback from marginalized groups, but it's also important to remember and be aware of the power dynamics of the situation. Some responses that you get back when they answer those questions might leave you feeling surprised or even dismayed. And if the person you're asking doesn't feel secure in their position, in their relationship with you, they don't trust this relationship, they might decide that it's too risky to be candid with you. So, no matter how awkward or uncomfortable it is to hear this, treat that feedback as a gift and really show that you value it. And take a moment to really reflect what about that feedback caused a gut reaction? What made it so uncomfortable to receive? Obviously, that's something that you might not be able to do in the moment. So, some handy phrases while you're working through that internally might be I recognize I have a lot of work to do. Or, hey, what, how can I make this right? What can I do different? Or, I believe you. This is something that you really are experiencing. So here's a few places that you might check out for doing that homework. So the Harvard Implicit Association or Implicit Bias Test is free and online. The 1619 Project is awesome. It won the Pulitzer Prize, and there are a lot of associated workbooks for people of all ages at the Pulitzer website. Human Rights Campaign does a lot of work for LGBTQ people. There are a lot of 21-day equity challenges. I think the first one that I can find is the one that's done by Eddie Moore Jr., but a lot of different organizations, including churches and community groups, are taking these on. And what I really like about them is that they're multimodal. They usually have a combination of videos to watch, podcasts to listen to, articles to read. So if one format is better or worse for you, there's still a lot of good content in that format. As I mentioned, local communities often have a lot of good content. So if you have a nearby higher ed institution, they probably have some sort of diversity office that does training. A lot of churches, a lot of nonprofits are trying to train and create growth in this area. Enabling certain features and technology works really well. For example, I've got live closed captioning on today for people who might have a hearing impairment. In Outlook, there is the Microsoft Inclusive Language Checker, which will, just like when you misspell something or have weird grammar, it'll squiggle underneath and say, hey, is that really what you want to say? Is that how you want to say that? Pretty handy. So calling out, calling in. So calling out refers to using a public space to tell someone that something that they said or something that they did was really hurtful. Handling microaggressions in the moment can be really difficult in particular, because if you wait too long to talk about it privately, the person who did that microaggression might have completely forgotten it. If you really want to try to do something right away, you you need to have some good ideas of how to do that without being too confrontational. And the ouch framework is a pretty helpful way to do this. The idea is when somebody makes a off-color joke or says something biased or just makes you feel uncomfortable, you make a comment or ask a question that gets the person to pause just for a second and think about what they said and why they said it, where that came from. So some questions you could ask are, I don't get it. What do you mean there? Or do you think that this might be true for other kinds of people too? What would allow you to think differently about this? Let's open this discussion to others. This is definitely one of those areas where you want to use I statements. I felt X when you said Y. And then sometimes calling in. Sometimes it's better to circle back in private, particularly when the situation is too hot to handle in the moment. The tactics you learn in crucial conversations can be really helpful here. So when an issue is overt and egregious, it's pretty straightforward to solely focus on the content. So just talk about what happened. When it's more subtle, it's a good idea to look for a pattern, gather more data and see, is this a one-off or a thing that keeps on happening? When you have the conversation, I think it's really good to center it around how it's negatively impacting a relationship. A cumulative pattern can really harm trust, cooperation, self-esteem, and this hurts everyone. As I mentioned before, it's really good to talk about the events using objective facts and frame the more emotional aspects with the I statements. You said this and I felt that. You do want to voice your perspective, but you also want to give others the opportunity to add their views. We aren't omniscient. Our understanding of any situation isn't going to be perfect. So it's also a good idea to test the accuracy, the relevance of your views by making it a safe space for others to express their views and share differing opinions. So mistakes are going to happen. I probably say 20 boneheaded things every day. But it's important to think about how you react when you do make a mistake. So a lot of the responses that you might hear when somebody points out, calls in something not so great are actually hurtful. So I'm going to put you through a thought exercise. Imagine that your privileged identity is you're somebody who has really heavy boots on, and people who have an oppressed identity are wearing sandals. So you accidentally step on one of their toes when you're out in public. How do you react when they say, ouch, you stepped on my toes? Do you say, I can't believe that you think I'm a toe stepper. No, I'm a good person. Or do you say, I'd move my foot if you asked more nicely? Or do you say, all toes matter? Or that you shouldn't have been walking around without wearing boots in the first place? All of these are pretty silly when you think about it in this situation. And in reality, most of us naturally know the right way to react when we accidentally step on someone's toes. I think using that as an example can help us learn the right way to react when we commit microaggressions. So center on the person who was impacted. Ask, are you okay? listen to their response and learn from it. Apologize for the impact, even though you didn't intend it. Stop the instance. Move your foot away. Stop the pattern. Be careful where you step in the future. Obviously, this analogy only stretches so far. In a perfect world, I guess everyone would be wearing sneakers, but we're doing the best we can here. It's really important to remember that when someone points these things out, it's not about you. You're not a jerk just because you misspoke. And don't overdo it either. Don't just be like, oh my God, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I think that once again brings the attention away from how it made the recipient feel and focuses it back on you. So the golden rule is treat others the way that you want to be treated. The platinum rule says treat others like they want to be treated, which I think is a lot better. But we aren't mind readers, and no two people are going to want the same thing. So we're gonna make mistakes sometimes, and that's going to happen. It's not the worst thing in the world. The important thing to remember is our goal is just progress, moving forward. Anything, just like anything that you want to learn, continuous improvement is really the key. Allowing the status quo to persist is really not going to help our society move forward. So we all need to work together and take a deliberate action, no matter how small, to create a better and equitable world for future generations. I really want to thank you all today for letting me be part of this DEI journey. Here's my contact info. And Denisha, are there any questions or comments since we have a bit of time?
Yeah, there are two more comments,
Sure.
both from Victoria. The first one that says I don't know. I think we're really just scratching the surface of LGBTQ. Transitioning, I think trans folks in the non-binary, male to female, female to male, gender fluid folks face special challenges.
Definitely.
The next one says, I think as an ally, it's hard to really understand in some cases. Black trans men and women getting even more hurdles to face in our society I can't even fathom.
Yeah, that's definitely true. So the term intersectionality, comes from research done in the 80s, actually. Kimberly Crenshaw is the law professor who came up with the term. And the idea behind it was back then in workplace law, let's say that like Black women were being discriminated against. If white women weren't receiving that same kind of discrimination, or if Black men weren't receiving that same kind of discrimination, then the courts at the time were saying there wasn't discrimination at all. That understanding that having those two identities together at the same time might be kind of larger than the sum of its parts in terms of how it harms people was like just not something people understood back then. And I think that that's pretty clear to us today. But then sometimes we don't always take into account identities that are less visible or things that we're just not as familiar with. And so it's hard for us to calculate or estimate how much more difficult things are when somebody has a different combination of identities than you do. All right. Are there any other comments, questions?
Nothing else has come in.
Okay, cool. Well, awesome. So as a reminder, our next session is in 2 weeks from today. And it will be part 2 of this DEI Foundations series. So the topic is diversity, equity, inclusion. What are the difference between these things? I'm really looking forward to talking about this with people, and I really appreciate the chance to do this today. And I'm so glad that PASS has started this virtual group. I'm just so grateful for this. So I'm really looking forward to what we can do moving forward.
Yes.
Yeah. And so, oops, let's see. So once again, here's our virtual group's details. You can go to pass.org and look up our virtual group. We also have a Twitter account that I'm not great at social media, but we're working on it. I'm really also excited that this year's PASS Summit is going to have not just a Women in Technology keynote, but also a DEI keynote. So we all have a long way to go, but I'm really happy about the direction that we're moving. And if there's nothing else, I will let people have a few minutes of their day back. Thanks so much for joining us, everyone.
Oh, Andrea, can you put the screen back on your contact information? There's
Oh,
people.
sure.
Yes, here's her email. This session is recorded, and you should get a link in your email where you can access that recording.
Yep.
Okay, I think we're good. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you, Andrea.
Yeah, absolutely. Have a great one, everyone.
Goodbye.
Bye. Let's see. I think